The domain of a graph is describing all possible inputs. Oftentimes, when I look at a graph, I think about how far left and how far right the graph extends. So let's look at an example. In this case, we have arrows on either side of our graph, which means our graph continues beyond what we see. And so in that case, that means our inputs are pretty much every number. And so the way we would write that is from negative infinity to infinity. Make sure that you're not putting less than or equal to, because x approaches infinity, but it'll never actually reach it. And so that's why we use those less than symbols. Over here, this graph also has arrows on either end. And so we have to think beyond what we see. And even though this graph looks really different than the one before, it has the same domain. This example is slightly different. We see a graph, like an arrow right here on the graph that continues on, but it doesn't go past this point. And so our domain is slightly different. The inputs that we can have, our graph goes to -2, and we have a closed circle, which means that x can be -2. And so we put -2 as less than or equal to x is less than infinity. Even though your graph is going down to negative infinity, it's the y values that are going to negative infinity. And as the y's keep getting lower, the x's keep going right on the x-axis, which is approaching infinity. Note that if you had an open circles, you would make sure you have a less than symbol. The less than or equal to means that you can actually have that x value as an input. And so that's why there's a closed circle and this less than or equal to right here. For this graph, we don't have arrows on either end, and so we only have x values between -4 and 0, and they're both included because we have closed circles or dots, and so that is why the domain is from negative infinity to 0. Make sure that you remember to put x in between these two values because the domain is describing all the possible x values of your graph. Here we have a graph that has a context attached to it, and so we have the estimated manufacturing costs of manufacturing some items. And even though we don't see like closed points or arrows continuing on, we just need to think about the context. Would it make sense for your graph to go beyond the y-axis to the left? Well, if we did that, that means our x's would be negative. And in this case, the x is representing items manufactured. So it wouldn't really make sense. And it's not even possible to make less than 0 items. And so we know that our domain is going to be from 0 to some number. And it's possible to manufacture more than 65 items, even though we don't see it. So theoretically, we have an arrow right here. However, that arrow makes it seem like we can make as many items, like an infinite amount of items, right? Which isn't necessarily realistic, but we don't know like the cutoff for this item. So with the information that's given, the domain is going to be from 0 to infinity, including the 0 and not including infinity. Make sure that when you're learning these key features, including domain, that you learn what the concept is and not just memorizing what domain is for quadratics, because it's important to be able to look at any type of graph and be able to describe the features of them.